Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. Welcome to Community Powered Workshop's annual event. For those new to Community Powered Workshop, we are a nonprofit organization that works alongside communities to create powerful and equitable places. I'm Nicole Jocelyn, Executive Director of Community Powered Workshop, and we believe in the strength of communities who use their collective voice to break barriers of systemic injustice. And we work to place their story at the center of community design.
Every year around this time, we try to bring our collective voices together to celebrate our community, hold space for difficult conversations, and re-energize for the work ahead. I am Marla Torrado, Planning Director at Community Powered Workshop, and I'm excited to see you all joining us virtually this year to talk about what justice looks like in our built environment and how we each have a part to play.
This year has looked a little different for us, as I'm sure it has for you too. I am Siobhan Otero, Community Coordinator at Community Powered Workshop, and we have certainly encountered our share of shifts this year. Shifts in how we use technology, shifts in how we collaborate as a team, and even shifts in how we prioritize the simplest things in our day-to-day. But we have also seen larger shifts occurring in our community across all levels and scales. We have seen the seeds of community power building start to sprout and critical questions surface about who has a seat at the table and how community voices can rise to the top of our collective conversations.
We are proud to be bringing our national and local communities together tonight for this conversation. I'm Thomas Medina, designer at Community Powered Workshop, and tonight we are excited to have Brian C. Lee Jr. here to share his insights and experiences advocating for design justice in his keynote presentation and to ground the conversation locally with our partners, João Paulo M. Connolly from the Austin Justice Coalition and Jessica Sager from the Williamson Creek Community Working Group.
We hope you're able to stick around after the panel for a live chat and 3 local DJs and their recorded set. I'm Victoria Valadez, and I manage communications for Community Powered Workshop. We've been working this year to elevate the discussion around design justice, and we really look forward to hearing your feedback around the discussion this evening.
Thanks, y'all. We'd also like to quickly thank our sponsors this evening. This year we have the Civilitude Group joining us as power partners, and we have a number of community builders this year, including McCann Adams Studio, J. Paul Company, the City of Austin Housing and Planning Department, the Austin Board of Realtors, Structure Development, Riverside Homes, and the Guadalupe Neighborhood Development Corporation. We also hope that everyone had a chance to order some refreshments this evening from Lazarus Brewery and Austin Daily Press with the discount codes that they provided us. Before we get too much further, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to share with y'all. First, if you need to adjust your audio, you can use the button that looks like a microphone in the bottom left corner of your screen. We will have everyone muted tonight. However, if you have any questions or comments for us or our speakers, please share them by clicking the Q&A or the chat buttons at the bottom center of your screen. And those buttons should be in the same place, whether you're on your computer or your phone. We invite you to submit questions at any time using the Q&A function. And we will try to get to as many of your questions as we can during the speaker panel or through the chat during the DJ sets at the end of the panel. So to start us out this evening, our team thought it might be helpful to take a few minutes to explain what exactly we mean when we say design justice and what it might look like on the ground. We've gathered our thoughts in a short animation that I'm happy to share with you now. And after that, we'll be joined by the Civilitude Group to introduce our keynote speaker. Enjoy.
In any house, you have different rooms for different purposes. And there's one room where you put all your junk when you're cleaning your house up for guests. You put all the stuff in the room that you don't want anybody to look at. The city is like a house. You know, this one room here might seem like the room with all the undesirable things, but it actually plays a fundamental role because this room is what allows the rest of the house to look the way it does. So this room is part of the structure of the houses. So then thinking about design justice has to be thinking about how can we completely redesign the house, but in such a way that there isn't this junk room, right? Because if not, you might take some people out of that segregated space, but then you're putting other people in. As long as you maintain that principle, and there's always going to be some element that you're casting out.
Design justice is expanding what the community's vision of what the community wants in design and creating the space.
In the bucket of design, I think leadership is a very clear caricature of the leader is the person with expertise in a certain subject matter, is someone who is respected as a leader, who holds traditional power, who is able to have the authority over the decision-making process and determine the outcomes. Leadership within design justice means that there is room for a lot of different expertise and perspectives, and for those expertise to be put at an equal footing or even elevate certain expertise that have been traditionally left out of the design process.
Design justice, the trust is placed on the people. It recognizes everyone is a leader or has the potential to be a leader. We just need to first know that we are, and that we all bring a different expertise to the table.
Equity means we all need to learn to share, but in sharing, the burden of sharing is heavier on some groups. Equity is that it affirms the need for intentional redress. So you can't just have some kind of colorblindness or some kind of generalized universal policy. You need to actually intentionally look for the harm that was made, and you have to go out of your way to see populations that were invisibilized.
Our voices are as important as the architect's voice, the planner's voice, the policymaker's voice. And in fact, I would even say more important.
It's important not just to incorporate community voices and listen to community voices, but to inspire people to think beyond, to help encourage people to allow themselves to imagine what was otherwise unimaginable. Or else we get stuck with this kind of status quo that we take to be absolute.
Push the process down, push the decision making down, push the design down so that people are involved. That creates the opportunity of trust, because then people know they're not just being informed, they're also participating, they're also engaging in the process, becoming this more and more multi-dimensional community speaking on its own behalf.
Community Powered Workshop is a nonprofit organization that works alongside communities to create powerful and equitable places. We do this through collaborative planning, community-driven research, and social impact design, where we support community-led solutions to create powerful places where all can thrive. We're always looking for better ways to mobilize that inherent strength of a community and use that as a platform to create more powerful places that support that collective vision. Power distribution through the design process is the outcome that we are working toward. That more equitable power dynamic and leadership structure will produce more just places in our built environment and in our public systems.
Hello, I'm Connor Kinney with the Civilitude Group. We're proud to be a sponsor of this event and Community Powered Workshop because we too believe that the community context of development is too often neglected. At last year's event, we introduced you to our new design build company, Construct and Opal. This year, we'd like to introduce you to our new development company, Capital A Housing. We specialize in using affordability unlocked and public funding to build income-restricted and mixed-income housing all over Austin. Together with our flagship engineering and planning company, Civilitude, we offer development services from soup to nuts, or just a la carte, to landowners, builders, developers, and investors for projects large and small. Just like you, our principals are deeply engaged in Austin's social and political fabric, and we excel in creating community-responsive projects. Now I'd like to introduce you to this event's keynote speaker. Brian C. Lee Jr. is the design principal of Colocate and is a national design justice advocate. Brian has a decade of experience in the field of architecture. He is the founding organizer of the Design Justice Platform and organized Design as Protest National Day of Action. Brian has led 2 award-winning architecture and design programs for high school students through the Arts Council of New Orleans and the National Organization of Minority Architects. Please join me as we welcome Brian.
Thank you everyone for inviting me to speak this evening. Again, my name is Brian C. Lee Jr., and I am the principal of a firm called Co-Locate Design out of New Orleans, Louisiana. I'm going to be giving a talk tonight that is centered on power and place, the power that is actively enlisted from the spaces and places that we exist, that we design, and that we cater to. Our name is a direct translation from collocation of words, colloquial and locate. So colloquial as the sophisticatedly informal use of formal language, and locate as a means to define a place or of place. And so we're talking about the sophisticatedly informal use or informal language of a place. And so when that comes to physical spaces, we're talking about the design language of place. What do people see, do, feel, build, create in their spaces that define who they are and how they interpret and engage with those spaces? And one of the additional things is that we are looking at the term co-locate itself. And I found this definition to be quite lovely. It really talks about the sequence of words and phrases habitually juxtaposed with another at a greater frequency than chance. And so as firm, we are actively seeking to seek out the sequence of people in place habitually juxtaposed at a greater frequency or a higher frequency than chance. And so in that work, we are defining how we believe we should operate by a few different core definitions. One really starts to speak to the fact that for our values are validated through the spaces and places we design. And within a racist system, we create monuments to that hubris. And if we're not actively seeking to dismantle white supremacist systems throughout the built environment, then ultimately those values then get ingrained within the physical environment. Secondarily, we're thinking about the ways that design justice looks like or is what love looks like in public spaces. It's a crib from Dr. Cornel West, which speaks to the fact that, speaks to the idea that justice is what love looks like in public. Right? Our idea should be this deep expression of care and love for our communities in physical form. What does it look like when we build with the same value and care that we put into our families, into our friends, into our community, into our loved ones? And then ultimately, this idea and acknowledgement that power has everything to do with the spaces and places that we exist within. The history of all revolutions is based in blood and land. It is the landless versus the landlord. And recognizing that power, recognizing the dynamic of that power allows us to better understand the systems that uphold that power and be able to challenge it when necessary. And so all of that wraps into the idea that we firmly believe that for nearly every injustice in this world, there is an architecture, a plan, a design that sustains it. And so whether or not we're dealing with climate change, we have to recognize that architecture and the built environment has a substantial impact on those outcomes. We have to recognize that if we're talking about housing or transportation or economic injustice, the remnants of redlining and other covenants or deeds play a substantial part in the way that injustice manifests itself to date. And so again, the more that we are able to pinpoint what that looks like, the better off we're going to be. And so design justice calls on us to forward a radical anti-racist vision for racial, social, and cultural reparation through the process and outcomes of design. Now, there are a couple points here that I want to bring up. Radical in that we are seeking to get to the root of a consideration. Radical, really the etymology of the word just speaks to the radish, and it is the root bulb. So are we comfortable challenging ourselves to get to the root of a particular condition? Can we move past non-racist ideologies and move towards an anti-racist ideology? Can we seek to repair for past conditions, even if we are not the ones who caused those past conditions? Can we establish and build out processes that reflect that need for radicalism, that reflect that need for reparation in the process, and then create an outcome that is through the design process that serves to support the communities that we are working with? So can we use design justice to challenge the privilege and power structures that use architecture and design as a tool of oppression? And so that calls us to really think about what that means in the built environment. Now, here is a set of demands and outcomes that we are seeking as a collective of organizers and as practitioners really within the design justice practice. Now, this is a few, not all, but it is a way for us to kind of structure our efforts and whether or not we are complicit in efforts that start to dismantle or harm communities long term. And so we're asking ourselves and our partners and comrades to really focus on how we divest from policing in our communities and how do we refund or invest in communities in real ways, in physical spaces that support the healing and belonging outcomes that we want to see in those spaces. How do we move past that and then into a way that we dismantle the carceral state or the prison and jail system, which jails 2.3 million people per year, most of which do not need to be in prison in some capacity, whether through drugs or whether through minor charges that have been built up over time. How do we end septet tactics? And so in a lot of our work, we are looking at the ways that we pursue natural surveillance, that we maintain defensible space, that we maintain our kind of tactical orientation of our buildings on sites to make sure that we are creating a quote unquote safety. But really, we are promoting a sense of suspicion oftentimes through this work and really doesn't give us the potential to do what we really should be doing, which is building community power through environmental design instead of seeking crime prevention specifically. How do we then enhance the self-determination of communities? What are the ways and the processes that we're using to build up our communities so that as new developments past the ones that we are working on proper come into a space, communities have the opportunity, the language, the voice to be able to speak out? How do we preserve and invest in Black cultural spaces and cultural spaces more broadly? Our job in this particular instance is to make sure that we are preserving spaces that hold on to the sociocultural, the kind of social histories of people in a particular place, whether it's in our towns, our cities, or the regions more broadly. How do we redefine what affordability means in neighborhoods? Utilizing area mean income is a faulty and flawed version of what we really should be recognizing, which is an extraction of wealth that has happened through federal, city, and community-based policies over time. So can we change those to really reflect what affordability means for people in a particular city? Can we shift policies that in public space that allow for democratic public spaces to be a part of our society on a day in, day out basis? The ability to stop shifting all of our public spaces into a privately owned condition allows us to, again, propose and support democratic public spaces throughout our cities and towns. Can we reimagine the financial structures and design so that we are not singularly beholden to one stream of revenue that oftentimes negates the values and needs of our communities proper? And then ultimately, how do we change the education space? How do we make sure that design education actively challenges our conceptions about what and how we should operate in and for our neighborhoods and communities? And so all of that requires us to understand power, right? It requires us to have a sense of how power is distributed and how we might actually be able to connect or challenge some of those moments. And so we ask people to think about this design continuum or this power continuum, which actually just says simply that there are signals and receivers. Signals are the things that are shooting out messages and telling us how we need to operate within a particular place. Receivers are simply the other, right? They are receiving these signals and they are saying, we hear you and we will respond in kind, or we hear you and we don't agree, right? And so the way that we're taught, the pedagogy that we're brought forth with tells us how we operate. That's infused into our policies, it's infused into the procedures that we have moving forward. And then on the other side of that, the practices that we operate, the projects and programs and the people, we are all receiving each individual signal about how we need to operate or how we need to move through space. And like I said, we can agree with it or we can disagree with it. And we can send a signal back saying so. And so I always try to point to one specific condition here. When we talk about redlining throughout the United States or the history of the United States, the policy of redlining specifically said that Black and people of color were categorized as undesirables. Now there's a difference between the policy and the procedure. See, The policy said undesirables, but the procedure, the way in which it was implemented in our work said Black. And so our ability to distinguish where the signals are coming from and how we want to respond is a tremendously important part of our ability to understand how power is distributed throughout systems. And so the better we are able to diagnose and understand that power structure, the more avidly we can address the points of the system that are affecting us more broadly. So really the points that affect us more broadly often boil down to a long and extended history that roots itself in a white supremacist or a racist from a racist lens. But it's difficult for us to have those conversations. Fear drives a lot of our decision making, and fear of being called names or being called out for existing within this white supremacist system often scares people off. And I ask people all the time, what are we afraid of? We're afraid to be called a racist. Well, the news is you should feel lucky because now you can get over it. Being called a racist is not the end all be all. The thing you want to get to. We have to recognize that we are all subject to these systems that are inherently racialized. And if we are not active, we become complicit within those systems. So our job then becomes to be anti-racist and recognize that our obligation to each other is to actively acknowledge those racialized and socialized biases and dismantle privilege and power structures that use whatever our system is as a means to perpetuate systems and reproduce systems of injustice in the world. And so that means recognizing what the isms are, recognizing that it's not just racism, it's sexism, it's ableism. All of these things are projected forces onto the operators of systems or the people within communities. And then there are operators of systems. And so we can be operators or we can be those who try to change those systems. And it's up to us what we want to do. And so the racism as a force and in its many different facets affects communities in their many different facets. And those communities, when applied with the force of racism, ableism, sexism, and affect us by creating different cultures. Because culture is a response to the forces applied to us, the prevailing environmental, geographic, social, political forces that address us on a day in, day out basis. It changes how we operate, how we move through space. Simply put, culture is a collective coping mechanism, one that is the consequence of persistent circumstance and immediate individual conditions. It's a way for us to understand and rationalize and adapt to the mental and physical processes of our environment in order to survive. That survival is for a purpose, and that purpose is to get to freedom. It is to get to liberation. And so our long path, the reason that we're challenging these systems, the reason that we're thinking radically about a just future is to formally get to a just and liberatory space. And that means that we have to recognize and understand what injustice is. And injustice is simply the way that systems are imbalanced to deny the equal distribution of access and resources, often to maintain power. And so we can be unjust and we can continue to create these reproducible systems of injustice, or we can be status quo. And there's a neutrality. That neutrality always lends itself to injustice, regardless of whether or not we believe we carry any of the isms within us. Now, beyond that, we think about equality, which we've all done for quite a while, where we're actively seeking an equal condition for all, but equality only asks us to be fair in the moment and to affirm a fairness moving forward. That's it. That's what equality asks us to do. Equity takes it one step forward and it says, I'm going to acknowledge a past of injustice and I'm going to affirm a fairness moving forward. It is to acknowledge a past of inequality, make fair in the present, and to affirm a standard of fairness moving forward. Now, justice, again, takes it one step forward and says, not only are we going to acknowledge a past, but we're going to repair that past of injustice. We're going to make fair in the present, and then we're going to remove barriers to progress for folks who have been marginalized moving forward. And then the last one, which is really difficult for folks, is to recognize that ultimately we all want to seek a level of collective freedom. And that freedom requires us to not just repair the past, not just to make fair in the present, not just to remove barriers to progress, but to affirmatively influence future outcomes for those who, again, who have been disinherited from a society who has put resources and assets and values in certain people's hands and privileged certain people over others. And so we ask then that we acknowledge some grounding definitions as we start to get to the work. What does the work start to look like? It requires us to understand a few things before we move forward. In our work, we ask our teams, our partners, our clients to really focus on the differences between outreach, engagement, and organizing. And so we are organizers and architects by trade, and we recognize that these are all tools for communication that are necessary moving forward, but our lean is to get people to start organizing rather than simply doing outreach. Outreach just calls on us to communicate what's going on forward. Engagement calls on us to think about the communication and the feedback loop. And then ultimately, organizing calls on us to think about the communication, the feedback, and how we build power in our communities. How do we strategically think about this work as a means to build power with people long term? Recognizing that there is a difference between neighborhoods and communities. Neighborhoods are the geographic boundaries that often hold communities, and the communities themselves is a term of ideological, spiritual, social gathering of groups within a space. They often have an affinity to place, but they are not place itself. And it is why communities are subject to being forced out of neighborhoods when capital markets do not value their lived experience. And then lastly, there's always this conversation about riot versus protest, and holding the line that riot is often used through the lens of architecture and physical space as both a colloquial term and a political term that is often to respond to disturbance of peace. But that is often a lens that is pervaded by a law enforcement perspective, right? And so we have to recognize where that term roots itself and what the difference between riot and protest are. And we call on people to protest. We call on everyone to think about design as a form of protest. And by that, we mean, how are we thinking about an unyielding faith in the power and potential of a just society? It is fundamentally about our collective hope for the work we do moving forward. And protest is just that, as is design. And so in this work, as we push forward, we are actively seeking to understand the difference between the processes and design. We are asking people to honor the griots, honor the people in our communities that have the history, that have the story, that have the knowledge. Make sure that we're building power in place. Make sure that we are respecting culture, not only as a long form of evolution, but also it is happening presently, it is happening immediately. Culture is both evolution and revolution. And then what are we doing to repair? How are we seeking reparation through the work that we're doing, through the processes that we're working on? From a position of design, how do we recognize that form follows fiction? It follows specifically in neighborhoods who have been historically disenfranchised. We're looking at the narratives, the stories of place that should define our form as much as anything else that we build. Can we imagine just futures through the work that we do? Can we commit to being radical in design? And then ultimately, again, can we design as a form of protest? And so we do that through these questions. We ask ourselves, who holds power in our communities? We ask what power structures directly impact our community? What are the injustices that are a result of that injustice? Who is directly and disproportionately impacted? How does it physically manifest in the built environment? And then lastly, what are the opportunities to create, imagine, visualize new models that can help to mitigate, eliminate, and repair for the injustices that we've seen in our environment? I want us to acknowledge the fact that all of what we just talked about really wraps itself around the physical elements of our neighborhoods and communities. And so as we're thinking about what policies, what procedures are implemented and manifest in our work, we actively have to understand how they are applied to our collective shelter, to our safety, education systems, our health systems food, our public recreation spaces, our cultural entertainment spaces, infrastructure, merch, civic spaces. All of these things are actively valuable to the complex system of neighborhoods. And the more that we recognize the interrelationship between those two and apply our policies, procedures, and ideologies to lifting these systems up within communities, specifically communities that have been disenfranchised, the better off we're going to be at large. And the acknowledgement then is that none of this is new. We are not starting from scratch, but we're also dealing with a history, a complex bureaucracy that has built upon itself over time, whether that's the Black codes in 1865 that established the South as codifying criminalization of Blackness, or Plessy versus Ferguson, or the Bauhaus kind of movement and modernism, which stripped away the kind of cultural continuity of local spaces and places, to Euclid versus Ambler, which helped to really start to think about our modern zoning considerations. The Federal Housing Authority in 1937, we saw redlining permeate from those decisions in the 30s, the Project Housing across the 40s, to federal highways across the 50s, to housing and urban development and mortgages as policymaking in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then HUD cutting its budgets in throughout the 80s into the 90s. These are all a part of a longer, more broad continuum. This could go on for multiple pages, but just giving you a brief understanding of what we are fighting against, the history that has been accumulating over time, and we have to challenge all of these things in order to move forward. All that to say, when we think about our values being validated in the spaces and places we design, we have to recognize that those things, while they are no longer shaped like you see them here on the right-hand side, where there's a colored entrance sign, we don't see colored only water fountains anymore. We don't see back of bus or folks being shunned at diner counters, or police leading people into schools, or water hoses in parks. We have to recognize that the remnants of all of these physical ideas that we've left in space still exist. And our relationship to those spaces has to change in order to change the spaces themselves. As we say, revolution happens through the claiming of space. And our culture is evolution, our culture is revolution. Those who have worked hard over many, many years, activists, organizers, designers, have all taken the steps that we've talked about today to not just build a safe and just community, but to build a path forward for our communities moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian, for sharing all of your experiences and expertise with us this evening. I know some people had some questions about materials being shared again after the event, and I totally get that. We'll be sharing a recording of the event afterwards. Because I know I always need to just study Brian's slides for hours and learn something new every time I see them. So thank you so much, Brian. I'm excited to bring you together now with our advocates and partners on the ground to dig into what design justice and injustice might look like here at home. For those who may have joined us a few minutes late, I'm Nicole Jocelyn, Executive Director of Community Powered Workshop, and we're very happy to have you here with us this evening. And thank you to everyone who's been keeping the conversation going in the chat. Just a quick reminder to please please submit any questions you have for our panelists through the Q&A button, and to share your thoughts through the chat as you guys have been doing. And don't forget to stick around after the panel to see our virtual DJ session featuring local DJs Mahlani, Rakiki, and Suspiros. And now we are honored to bring João Paulo M. Connolly and Jessica Sager into the conversation this evening. João Paulo serves as the Director of Housing and Community Development for the Austin Justice Coalition, where he focuses on housing and anti-displacement policy. He draws on his upbringing in Brazil and experiences as an interpreter in underserved communities to collaborate with community members to build strategies for resilience and economic justice. Jessica is a small business and nonprofit strategist who helps grow leaders and organizations committed to doing good. Jessica is also passionate about making the world a smaller place through connecting people, ideas, and opportunities, starting in her own backyard. We at Community Powered Workshop know Jessica as an active community advocate in the Heartwood neighborhood, where she has been an integral part of the Williamson Creek Community Working Group. And I invite Brian and JP and Jessica to join me on the screen now for the panel discussion.
All right. Someone needs to turn on my video.
Oh, sorry, Brian.
It's all good.
Well, I asked you to start the video just now, so
Great.
I guess that's the permission you needed.
All right. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys all for joining us this evening. I thought I would start it off by kicking it over to you, JP. Just after hearing Brian's reflections, I'm wondering if you might be able to start us out by sharing what injustices you've seen in our community and how they show up in our built environment.
Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, there's so much in Brian's presentation that just really connects and speaks to so many of the kind of urban struggles that we're facing right now in Austin. That there's a lot to unpack there and we could go over. So I picked a couple of highlights that are kind of things that are blinking on the radar right now that I think are excellent examples of some of the concepts that Brian breaks down about power, about strategic power building and community. And one of the things I want to talk about is the role that time plays in the way that those in power control the decision-making process, and the way that timelines are used to limit the community's ability to really participate in and construct and help imagine the future. One example of that is I-35, this highway, which was historically built as a kind. It was built over what was once East Avenue. It displaced communities of color as interstate highways have done throughout the country. And I-35 also, was the kind of de facto segregating line between the white Austin and the black and brown part of town, which was East Austin. And so then recently we've been having these community conversations about, reimagining the future of I-35 and thinking about what that could look like. What would happen if we reimagined this highway? And there's been a community process, and there have been community input and panels and conversations, and yet it still seems like the community has very little ability to actually influence the decision. And some of the designs that were put forward by TxDOT are really just kind of horrible designs that expand the highway, add 8 more lanes to the highway, and sort of do all the things that are the opposite of what the community wants. And so I think this kind of ties back into these questions of struggle. There's usually a very short period of time for community input, and those decisions happen very quickly, and it's very hard to kind of wedge your way into those spaces. And when you do, usually you have to work on ridiculously tight timelines. Another example of that is right now we're living this in absolute real time. In Austin, the city is about to begin construction on this massive new transit project, Project Connect. And the community is, the city will be picking a board. The board members who will be managing the Austin Transit Partnership, which is this organization which will build out this infrastructure. And yet the timeline to define who are going to be the members on this board is so ridiculously tight it makes it virtually impossible for there to be real meaningful community input. And part of this is, it feels like it's really designed to keep community out. And part of this is also just the timeline of investment capital. It feels like investment capital sets this fluid, accelerated pace to everything. Everything has to happen quickly because everything costs money, everything is going to get more expensive, everything is going to get more difficult. So if things don't move very quickly, then you lose at this game of trying to keep up with investment capital. So anyway, I want to talk about these two examples that touch on mobility and housing, and there's so many more, but I wanted to bring in this question about the role that very limited timelines play in controlling power. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that, Brian.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, the time plays a huge part in our decision-making process, and not just from the scale of our policies, but our day in, day out lives. We often talk about the kind of core daily decisions that one has to make when you live in poverty versus those who have to make decisions when you have wealth. And the difference between those things being that wealth automates so many of our decisions, right? It allows us to have a longer time span to make the critical ones. Poverty amplifies the necessity to make decisions minute by minute. And so our kind of instinct is that those with money, have to make more decisions because they are because of their return on investment, because of those things. But it's exactly the opposite. And so when you have to make a decision literally minute to minute or hour to hour, our ability to think past that becomes stunted. It also means that we don't have time. Both we don't have the time to deal with bullshit from developers, excuse my language. But on the other end, we need more time from those who have the power in order to articulate a vision when you're disconnected from the opportunities to make those visions. So it's a very complex world in which time plays a substantial role in how we move a lot of this stuff forward. So yeah, that we really should bring into every part of these discussions. There's a diagram that I have that I will send to everyone.
Of course there is.
It's somewhere in a sketchbook and I'll bring it out.
Well, this conversation it reminds me of the core questions, Brian, that you presented in your work and how you guys approach design justice and how to reimagine systems. I wonder if you can dig a little bit more into how we might reimagine these kinds of systems that have all of these time constraints and sort of false urgencies in order to help us create spaces that shift power to build more just places in our neighborhoods and communities.
Yeah, it's huge, right? I mean, I think the reason there are so many different kind of grounding mechanisms that you see within the presentation is in large part because it's hard to grasp these ephemeral and hyper complex, hyper kind of palimpsested systems, right? Like there's so much to it, and again, that time thing comes into being where it's hard to wrap your head around all of it at one time. And so, but we believe, again, if we're able to identify power, whatever that power may be, if we can get used to the tool, the practice of understanding not just that there is power in a particular location, but what are the conduits that feed that power? What are the systems that maintain that power? And then are people gatekeepers versus power sources, right? Like there's all of these things that before we start to make decisions about what's physically going into space, our lack of recognition around those who hold power and what decisions are auto-scripted for them is extremely important. So when we talk about anchoring our core questions around what, who holds power, it's not just superfluous. It is really a way for us to understand the right decisions to make as we get to the opportunities part of that. And then I guess the second thing out of that core set of questions that I think is important, and I think it's the first three questions that I want people to always focus on, which is like, who holds power? What's the injustice that people are facing as a result of that power? And it's usually multiple. So when we think about housing injustice, there's those who hold power purvey over eviction considerations, houselessness. They purvey over people living at the edge of their kind of rent limits, and all of the other kind of housing trajectory issues that we see in a particular place, right? So it's not just one thing that happens as a result of the sources of power. But the third thing is like, how does it physically manifest? And this is always difficult for people because architecture is so peripheral, especially for those who are not in the profession. Architecture and planning is very, very peripheral. And so if we can take the time to recognize and see the hardware to the software that is life, we can actually start to see the mechanics of a system that is invisible to so many. So I think it's important that you ask that question, because those questions are, again, not just secondary considerations for us. They are fundamental to how we approach anything before we get to a design consideration. We have to know how we're operating and what grounds we're operating within.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. That reminds me a lot of what you're saying is obviously sort of from the perspective of folks that are designers and working, with clients, with communities, and sort of doing this work with a design justice mentality and a framework there. I wonder also sort of what that experience is from the other side, from the community side, from the folks that you're working alongside to do all of this good work. And I know that Jessica has had a lot of experience with this lately, with some work that we've been doing with you, Jessica. And I just sort of wonder, in your role as a community member and also just in your profession, what does it look like to build power from your side of things? And how do you see the role of other people in building that power, whether you're a designer or a community member, and whatever kinds of expertise you're bringing to the table?
Yeah. One of the things I was thinking about as we were leading into this was, because I have a background, I love dance, and the using power becomes sort of like a dance in terms of, when do I need to step in front? When do I need to lead the way, using my whiteness, using my privilege, using my time, and be able to use that to leverage something that needs to happen. We're here because I got to start the Heartwood Community Garden, which was something that people had wanted for years, but for any number of reasons hadn't been successful at. And I'm very humbled by, I was able to leverage what I was given to have it happen. So it's, where can I do that? And then the really important question that comes up for that first dance step is moving forward, and then it's moving back, and it's looking for who's not there, what are the people and places and other things going on that I need to get behind as soon as possible, and being aware, of who's not in the room, who's doing things, in a world where we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And so I try, and even outside of this work, work in other parts of Austin, because Austin's my hometown, of who can I get behind who's doing design justice work. I have a fabulous colleague, Harold McMillan, who's doing amazing work with the African American Cultural Heritage District and different things that are being done in Austin right now. Where can I use my skills and help people be more successful in what they're doing and what they're trying to put forth?
Nice. JP, what does that power building look like at Austin Justice Coalition and the work that you guys have been doing? Where do you see that intersecting with what we're talking about here?
I think it's interesting because AJC, we started off very much as a protest group focused primarily on action in the streets. And I think that that is still the core of who we are, and we still will continue to organize protests and direct action in the streets always. And we moved from doing that to also trying to incorporate policy work, which policy work gets you then back into this question of the timeline. You work your way into the room, you figure out that something is going on, and you have a limited amount of time to affect change. So you have to get back to the community, mobilize people, talk about what's happening, and try to organize something, and always working with pretty tight deadlines. So I think that, you know, we move back and forth between policy spaces and kind of direct community building and power building in the streets, and trying to always kind of push towards that bigger picture liberation that Brian is talking about, but also insisting that the city think about equity in moving forward and thinking about different, you know, and there's a whole range of issues where it's so important that we start thinking about equity. I'm just going to give one example, is the question of density. You know, how the city thinks about where it needs to distribute its housing stock and its density, and the, you know, AJC's insistence in critiquing the process around the land development code is to say that we can't just continue with a process where we say, okay, in this one section of the city, that's where all the density goes. But, you know, that's where all of our affordable housing will go, in this one part of town. But really, how can we rethink that and insist that there be more opportunities for affordable housing in other parts of the city? And then this, of course, also, you know, I have to, you know, nod to what Brian said about rethinking and critiquing the concept of affordability itself. I think is also extremely important. And that's something that I would love to hear a little bit more from Brian about, if there has been some thought to alternative ways of thinking about metrics for affordability, you know, moving beyond this idea of the median area income or median family income, which we use in this town. And if there have been other concepts, you know, we've been thinking about, you know, looking at, for instance, affordability around transit based on, you know, the income of the city's transit dependent, you know, core transit riders, using that as a metric for affordability, or other things. I was curious to hear what some of Brian's ideas might be.
Yeah, I think it's a combination. It's never as simple as a singular consideration, but we often point people towards wealth as an indicator. So even if it's median, and if we were to just say median family wealth or area median wealth, that reflects the extraction from Black and Brown communities over a history of time, right? As I mentioned when we talked earlier, and when we think about median household wealth in white families across this country, we're talking $120,000 to $130,000. Now, depending on which surveys you're looking at, and for Black families and Hispanic and Latino families, we're talking between, you know, 17 and 7, right? Like just in terms of $17,000, right? Like it's such a clear distinction, regardless of what you make in income year over year. The coverage that one has through a wealth perspective or through an income perspective versus a wealth perspective is very much rooted in the extraction of that wealth over time. And so I think the core of the idea is simply what you mentioned, which is focus on the least of these, focus on those who have been harmed by the system in perpetuity, and see what the mass of those communities are dealing with at their base.
Thank you for that.
Yeah,
thanks, Brian.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left of our panel discussion. And I wanted to make sure we have sort of a closing question for you all to each hit on. And we've had some conversation in the Q&A in the chat about, you know, sort of like what people might be able to do to forward these design justice principles and outcomes, and like, what does this action look like in a way that sort of honors people's experience and expertise, no matter where they're coming from. Whoever wants to go first.
Are we answering a specific question, or are we just
What would you say to people on this call that are like, yeah, Brian, I get it and I want to do it, but I'm not an architect, or I am an architect, or I'm a planner, or whatever. What does that activity look like on the ground to you?
Oh, I love it. Okay, so I'm just gonna say a bunch of things that I think are really, really helpful at what we've seen.
Really short though.
But very shortly. Okay, quickly. If you work in the city, or if you work from a policy perspective, write and think about RFPs that speak about design justice. If you work and are a community member, know that you're, think about like community design advocate credentialing. So other organizations that serve to support you in that effort. If you work in the field, make sure that you're seeking projects that actually live by a design justice methodology and ask you to do that type of work. And yeah, that's what I'll say for now. Thank you.
Thanks. Jessica, how about you?
Sure. I started a community garden and I had not grown a tomato. So you don't have to have any gardening experience to start a community garden. You don't have to have the experience. I think so often we get these mental blocks of, oh, once I get a credential, then I can go do something too. And my thought is like, show up, don't give up. Like people like the Bryans and the JPs need more manpower. Like show up and get behind and don't give up, because community organizing and doing these things is hard. When you're listening for community, it is, my word always is humbling. Like this work is humbling. So be willing to be humbled and then also be willing to listen. So it's like, show up, don't give up, be humbled and listen.
I don't really have a lot to follow all that with. I hope that we can continue to allow ourselves to do this kind of rethinking of a lot of things that we take for granted. The idea that we, for instance, the concept of ownership and the way that we rely on that kind of metaphor of ownership. Another thing I think that I love the emphasis on people, bringing the conversation back to people as the real placemakers and people make place. And oftentimes I think we can fall into a trap of a kind of architectural determinism almost, where we think so much about, well, if we can only preserve a certain structure, but then we lose sight of the people who used to live in that structure and who really made that culture alive. So I think that, when we think about anti-displacement policy, thinking how can we keep the people in the neighborhood, not just the structures. And so I think that's there's a whole range of these questions where I think this is a beautiful time where we can really allow ourselves to challenge so many of these concepts. So let's to step outside this.
Great. Thanks, JP. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this evening and for sharing all of your fabulous insights with us. We'll move on now to the next segment of what we have planned for everybody this evening. So thank you guys all for sticking around, sticking with us. We still have our full audience, which I'm so happy to see you guys staying with us. And thanks for keeping things going in the chat. I'm definitely going to go back and read all of the things that you guys are saying there because I can't follow it all right now. So we're about to start our DJ session. So I hope you stick around for that. And also during the DJ sets, we will launch a few polling questions just to help prompt some reflection and conversation in the chat. And all you need to do is select your response in the poll and hit submit, and then we'll share the results of those as they come through. And thank you all again for joining us this evening, and thanks to all of our sponsors again this year. It's because of the support of our sponsors that we can bring the content for this event to you for free this evening. And if you enjoyed yourself, I'd invite you to also visit our website, communitypoweredworkshop.org, to sign up for our newsletter so we can stay in touch. We'll be building on the content from this evening that's come through in the chat and the Q&A that we might not have gotten to in the panel discussion. And we'd like to be able to share all of those things with you through our newsletter if you're interested. Also on our website, like any good nonprofit, you'll find a little donate button at the top right corner of the menu bar. Some of y'all might have noticed when you registered that we will be sending a little surprise gift out to those who donate $25 and above. And if you haven't had a chance to contribute yet, but would like to, you can still do that through our website. So now please join me in welcoming DJs Mahalani, Rakiki, and Sispiros. See y'all on the other side. Thank you so much.
We don't need no truth, got plenty, now it grows on trees. We don't need no truth, got plenty, now it grows on trees. We don't need no truth, got plenty, now it grows on trees. God, I'm glad it's not a race I lose. There's no saint and there's no sinner done more dirt than me. Another who can do more right than me. I need to find a paradise for me. When we want it, we just ask it. God is ready, but you don't want it. Don't tell me heaven's waiting for the sun. God is ready when you're ready. Shine your heaven's waiting for the sun. God is ready when you're ready. Shine. Porque negar nuestros anhelos, porque suprimir todo deseo, porque anular esta alegría. Si todo en la vida es materia prima, tú sabes que te quiero. Entonces deja de fruncir el ceño. No quieras más sentirte solo. Tanto fatalismo es casi gracioso. Tengo la cura para ti, el consuelo para mí. Tengo el alivio de raíz, solo quiero verte feliz. Tengo la cura para ti, el consuelo para mí. Tengo el alivio de raíz, solo quiero verte feliz. Solo quiero, solo quiero, solo quiero, solo quiero, solo quiero, solo quiero, solo quiero verte feliz. Solo quiero, solo quiero, solo quiero, solo quiero, solo quiero verte. Solo quiero verte feliz. Solo quiero. Solo quiero. Solo quiero verte. Solo quiero verte feliz. bailar, le mueves para acá, le mueves para allá. Es el nuevo baile de la tecnocumbia. Le mueves para acá, le mueves para allá. Es el nuevo baile de la tecnocumbia. Le mueves para acá, le mueves para allá. Es el nuevo baile de la tecnocumbia. Le mueves para acá, le mueves para allá. Es el nuevo baile de la tecnocumbia. Buy it, use it, break it, fix it, trash it, change it, mail, upgrade it, charge it, point it, zoom it, press it, snap it, work it, quick erase it, write it, cut it, paste it, save it, load it, check it, quick rewrite it, plug it, play it, burn it, rip it, drag it, drop it, zip and zip it, lie it, use it, break it, fix it, trash it, change it, mail, upgrade it, charge it, point it, zoom it, press it, snap it, work it, quick erase it, write it, cut it, paste it, save it, load it, check it, quick rewrite it, plug it, play it, burn it, rip it, drag it, drop it, zip and zip it, lie it, use it, break it, fix it, trash it, change it, mail, upgrade it, charge it, point it, zoom it, press it, snap it, work it, quick erase it, write it, cut it, paste it, save it, load it, check it, quick rewrite it, plug it, play it, burn it, rip it, drag it, drop it, drop it. Drag it, drop it, drop it. Touch it, bring it, pay it, watch it, turn it, leave it, stop, format it. Touch it, bring it, pay it, watch it, turn it, leave it, stop, format it. Touch it, bring it, pay it, watch it, turn it, leave it, stop, format it. Touch it, bring it, pay it, watch it, turn it, leave it, stop, format it.
There was a time when love was a chosen.
Thank you all again for joining us for this lively conversation and a little fun this evening. We hope you found it informative, entertaining, and most importantly, powerful. Please feel free to reach out to us at any time for anything we can help you with. And we look forward to seeing you around, either on the other side of a screen or out in the wild. Stay safe, everyone. Thanks.